Hello, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of our forum, Arts in the Digital Age. I'm Irini Papadimitriou, and I'm the creative director of FutureEverything. And we've curated the forum in collaboration with the British Council in Jordan. Yesterday, which was the first day of the forum, we heard from artists like Semiconductor and Kit Monkman about their practices, how they engage with digital, how they engage with audiences, and where they work. We also heard from Hint Zuka, from founder of Art Mejo, the platform that presents work across the Arab world. We heard findings from research that she conducted, commissioned by the British Council in Jordan, about digital art practices and how artists in Jordan engage with digital, but also how organizations engage with digital. And I'm looking forward today to a second round of presentations from some brilliant people. And we have 2 sessions taking place for the first part in our forum today. The first one, called What's the NFT? Brings together brilliant artists Matthew Plummer Fernandez and Julie Freeman, who will be sharing their views, but also their experience in engaging with NFTs as well. We've been hearing so much the past few years about NFTs, and there is so much online about NFTs that now when you Google digital art, what comes first is actually NFTs. So we will be hearing from them about what is going on, how NFTs have boomed suddenly, how artists are engaging with this, and what's the whole thing, what everything means, but also how the challenges behind these systems as well. And then the second session for today, Curating Digital Art, will bring together curators, producers, and artists, Hannah Redler-Hose, Tom Hayam, and Khaldun Hijazin, who will be talking about how curators and art institutions are responding to digital art practices and how they commission, produce, display, maintain, and preserve digital art, and also how they adapt to these practices. Without further ado, also, sorry, just to say that in the second part today, we will have a masterclass led by Alex May, and there is a separate registration for that. So if you have registered, then you should have received a different link. But without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker today, Matthew Plummer Fernandez, British Columbian artist whose work explores algorithmic systems, popular culture, and contemporary issues, with influences by the traditions of generative art, critical design, and internet art that he describes as algopop. And Matthew's work has been exhibited internationally and has been commissioned by organizations like the V&A and Somerset House in London, Abandon Normal Devices Festival in Manchester, ZKM in Karlsruhe, and many more. And his works are in the collection of Centre Pompidou in Paris. And also in 2014, he received an award of distinction at Ars Electronica. Matthew has received an MA from London's Royal College of Art in 2009, and he completed his PhD at Goldsmiths. And he's currently the course leader in BA Fine Art, Computational Arts at Camberwell College of Arts, and also a senior lecturer at the Creative Computing Institute, University of Arts, London. Matthew, welcome, and the floor is yours, and we're looking forward to hear from you. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Irini, and thanks for inviting me to be here. So before I share my screen, I should just speak freely to the camera so you know who's talking when you see my slides. As Irini said, I'm Matthew Plum Fernandez. I'm an artist. I've been a practicing artist for the last 15 years, more or less, mostly working in the sort of wider field of media art, so working with, well, everything from like sculpture to animation, installation art. However, obviously, the pandemic has sort of really pushed me to innovate in ways in which I explore my practice and disseminate my work. And NFTs has provided me with kind of an interesting solution, an area to experiment in, but also doing it through a very critical lens, and a lens through which I can get to sort of really participate in this field for better understanding of it. Partly because as an educator, it's my duty to understand these systems and better inform students and other artists of how it all works. It's the sort of approach that I take. So I'll just share my slides now. Great, hopefully you can all see that. Let me just edit Zoom so I can still see some little square boxes, even though you have your cameras off. It always helps. So yeah, as Zarine said, I sort of wear multiple hats at the moment because I'm also a senior lecturer and course leader in a new course called BA Computational Art, which is at Camberwell College of Arts. It's a very traditional fine art school, really. It has drawing, printing, sculpture, photography, and now it has computational art. So it's a really kind of interesting experiment into bringing computational art to a BA fine art level. And I'm also a senior lecturer at the Creative Computing Institute, which is a little bit more established now. It's in its third year, a college within the University Arts London as well, that is very much focused on creative computing and comes more from a tradition of computing as a discipline. So a lot of what I'm going to say is reference to an essay that I wrote called Not Another JPEG. You can read it on my website if you want, plummerfernandez.com/works/not another JPEG, or you can find a link there on the main page. And it really was something, I guess it was my introduction to why I was getting into NFTs in the first place. I wrote this in April last year. I'd only been participating in NFTs for a few weeks, yet a lot of the things that I wrote about have stood the test of time. You know, they're still relevant with some kind of changes in ecosystems and the tools that we use. But primarily, I think the sort of bulk of what I write really stands true still. So one of the platforms that the main platform that I used to use for disseminating my work in an NFT space was through Hikeknook. It was often abbreviated to HEN. I talk about it in the past tense now because the website actually closed. We'll talk about that in a minute. And the URL is hikeknook.xyz, which I think is still active. But yeah, you know, we'll talk about the sort of problems with Hikeknook as the talk progresses. So Hikeknook was started by a technologist and sociologist in Brazil called Rafael Lima, who was looking at alternative systems for artistic communities to engage with one another. And he really intended it from kind of a radical standpoint, thinking about his own immediate community, which was Brazilian artists, how they could participate in online marketplaces that were more accessible, more inclusive, and had less barriers to entry. So a lot of the other big NFT marketplaces were heavily curated. They would cost money to participate in because there was expensive transaction fees and fees for minting work on those platforms. So he created from the ground up his own very grassroots system using a different blockchain. We'll go into the blockchain further on. But Hikeknook was created, and I joined pretty early on. It started in early March, and I think by mid-March I was already putting my work there. And for me, it was, you know, a totally new concept. I hadn't participated in any NFT marketplaces before. There was other NFT marketplaces, mainly on the Ethereum blockchain. And this was the first Tezos-based blockchain. So Tezos was another blockchain. And I'll go into Tezos a little bit in a little bit. So this is actually quite an old screenshot because this is like where my portfolio on Hikeknook was back around April last year. And I developed a new body of work, a series of images generated with machine learning. called cave paintings, and they were these kind of fantastical caves that were imagined by an AI, guided by my prompts. So I'd write out certain words, and it would kind of guide the images to be generated in a certain style. And what was nice was working iteratively. So each week, I'd create a new work. And what was nice is that the funding model always allowed for further exploration and further engagement with this series. So I found like this to be quite a healthy relationship with audiences, where audiences are sort of appreciating the work and then helping fund the continuation of the work into a series. So a lot of work that artists do on NFT spaces are series, because it's, I guess, well, from one perspective, the collector prefers a series because they can kind of collect them all. It becomes very Pokemon-like. You start collecting one and then you want all of them. But it also helps collectors sort of assess other mechanics within the NFT market spaces. Obviously a lot of collectors are interested in the value of works, and it's easy to compare one cave to another rather than, a sculpture I've made with a cave I've made. So somehow collections seem to become the format for a lot of NFT-based work. So the other interesting thing about Hic et Nunc compared to some of the other marketplaces is that most of the work would be created as multiple editions, so that you would actually sell one work to many collectors. They were all collecting an edition of that particular artwork. And this has a really fascinating implications for the artist and for the collector, because essentially you're creating a community of strangers from all over the world that somehow sign co-ownership over an artwork. So they're all sort of bound to each other's pricing in the secondary markets, and they might talk about the art over Discords or over Twitter. So it creates an interesting engagement with audiences, where those audience members all start getting to understand each other because they have shared interests and shared responsibilities over their collections. And it differentiated. It helped differentiate Hic et Nunc from other marketplaces where the strategy was usually to have kind of one-off artworks. And these have been popularized by the press. You hear about artists creating a one-off artwork that it kind of, I guess, goes against what we understand digital culture to be, that, you have endless downloads of the same image or of the same song, and then suddenly you were just trying to narrow it down to one thing. So Hic et Nunc felt kind of like a compromise where, you would have like a limited run of these NFTs, but you would have at least multiple people collecting. And some artists would, create really large, endless open editions so that, as many people as you like could collect them for a low fee. And it was interesting, the dynamics of this also meant that a lot of artwork on Tezos was very affordable, because you were only buying a small edition, but those editions would add up to be a substantial profit for the artist. So this was kind of like what a collection looks like on Hic et Nunc. I can see an Aurea Harvey there, and so this is like some of my early. I think I got Zach Lieberman there, and I was like collecting early on, just collecting artists that I knew. There's a Marius Watts that I collected, but I'm also collecting a lot of artists from Brazil, and artists from very different backgrounds who I normally not engage with through normal channels of dissemination and group shows. So it's a really nice way of engaging with artists from all different backgrounds and different disciplines. And what was nice about Hic et Nunc is there's this real spirit of helping other people and raising money. So SOS Colombia was something I participated in to raise money for protests in Colombia. And another thing that came out of Hic et Nunc was this whole ecosystem of third-party tools. The website itself was quite limited in its functionality, And the Rafael Lima's response to that was, well, we're open source, so you're welcome to add those extra features that you so desperately want through your own through your own apps that would engage with the marketplace. So Hikeknook was open source. And so if, say, you wanted to have some sort of ranking system where you could see like the top sales of the day, someone built an app for that. I had like another app that I'd used just to like put some of the data in plain language so I could see who was purchasing my work. This is a tool called Hictory. So all these other apps that pop up, usually by members of that community, artists, collectors that, you know, desperately wanted other features and other ways of engaging with the site. So in a way, what was interesting about Web3 technology was that it sort of involved a level of kind of citizenship and participation that you don't get in Web 2.0. You're not just there as a passive consumer using apps. You're sort of servicing and adding your own sort of input to that ecosystem, participating with whatever skill set you have, even if it's just to organize people on Discords or chatting about things and organizing talks. If you have like development tool skills, you might be developing third-party tools. So Hikeknook closed actually, I think it was in November. And this sparked like the sort of Tezos community, the community of artists, to sort of take that open source platform and re-implement it, create a mirror site and give it a new name. And it's since become named Taya after a long process of community polls and yeah, kind of a lengthy discussions about the sort of rebranding of Hikeknook. So I put out this meme, which was, this is how it felt like to be during those 4 months, those last 4 months of the year, as an artist, because it was actually quite anxiety inducing. And I think this is something that we've kind of learned through experience, is that actually there's a huge pressure on artists to constantly be supplying artworks or to be kind of conditioning their sort of supply and demand favorably towards collectors. And so there's this kind of ongoing pressure that we, you know, didn't have to really deal with before. So it's quite interesting to sort of bear the brunt of those ups and downs. And a lot of those ups and downs are conditions that are outside of your control. You know, the crypto market fluctuates, the currencies in which you're trading fluctuates. So there's kind of these extra ups and downs to consider. And obviously closing off a marketplace, you know, in November was like a huge blow. And then December is this kind of this renewed energy. Everyone's kind of rallying together, building tools, building new platforms. And lots of platforms did come out of that energy. So Taya is obviously one kind of very close reinstatement of Hikeknook. However, other Tezos-based platforms emerged, such as Versum, which again come from community members, come from people that were developers at Hikeknook, taking some of their knowledge and their experience towards creating better products. So I'll just tell you a little bit about Tezos. Tezos is a blockchain that uses proof of stake technology. And this makes it different from some of the other blockchains that you might have heard of, such as Ethereum and Bitcoin. Proof of stake doesn't require the sort of the intensive computations needed to perform transactions and perform calculations on the blockchain. And so instead of your data going to these big servers to be processed, and you can, you know, sometimes see blockchains are powered by huge grids of servers, it goes to a decentralized system of servers that are run by different nodes. And they sort of cross-reference data amongst themselves, and they all have a stake. They have a financial stake in the system. So if they were to try and cheat and edit the blockchain in any way, they would be penalized. They would lose their stake. So this proof of stake means it's kind of a self-correcting system. You know, the sort of distribution of servers and different people owning those servers means that somehow it kind of all works without having to do these intensive crypto calculations. And yeah, this system is called proof of stake, and because of this, the carbon footprint per transaction is much lower on a proof of stake blockchain than a proof of work blockchain such as Ethereum. So I'll tell you just a little bit more about the cave painting series that I developed as part of my exploration of using the system. This is kind of a small animation of more or less what's happening behind the scenes. Essentially, I have my own kind of machine learning neural network system. It's based on technology that was made available by a company called OpenAI. They created new tools by which you could generate images by supplying it with text-based prompts. So you give a description of an image and it tries to create an image that matches that description. However, I found that you can really tease out these very surrealist images by creating descriptions of things that don't exist in real life. So I was describing caves that obviously don't exist, and trying like interesting little variations on the prompt, just putting in keywords, finding which keywords trigger the neural network to go in a certain direction. So that I kind of have this kind of endless back and forth with this AI, finding exactly how best to communicate with it. And this has been kind of an iterative process. I keep finding new tricks, new ways in which I can take this series further. And more recently, now with Versum, I've managed to sort of start a new collection, a subset of cave paintings that are animated. So this involves feeding the sort of each frame that it generates, feeding it back, sort of resizing it, cropping it, feeding back into the neural net, so it creates the next frame, and then you end up with a series of frames that, it's a bit like stop frame animation. You put all those frames together and it suddenly appears to be animated. So this is kind of what I'm exploring now. And I've also explored using another website that came out of the Tezos ecosystem, is more based on generative art practices, so that instead of supplying, a multiple edition, all of the same artwork, they have a system where each collector generates a slightly different variation of the artwork. So I've created for that marketplace a series called Roots, and every time someone collects one of the roots, it generates a different root ball. So I'm going to just finish up with one of the things that I found really fascinating about working with NFTs is how this work is displayed, is disseminated by other people. There's apps such as OnCyber, which allows collectors to create these virtual galleries. And so I found myself in these like really random group shows. Yeah, you can open up a show with your collection or with a subset of your collection that's more curated and invite people to walk around it. So it's quite nice to have this side to my practice that's slightly out of my control. Don't really have to worry about it too much. It's going to happen anyway. And some of these shows are a little bit more bespoke, and sometimes a bit controversial. Some artists feel sort of slightly irritated by the sort of the sort of freedom that collectors supposedly have, that they can go on and they can kind of put their work in any context. They can decide how to display it, whether to make it big or small. So it's kind of an interesting kind of new problem to have, really. How do we have these conversations and dialogues with collectors that now want to curate and create virtual exhibitions? Does the artist still have a say over how it's displayed, or who's, whether you even participate in or not? So it does create some interesting tensions there. And obviously, a lot of the work is designed for being in collections, so people have them on their displays in their homes. and sometimes it ends up on book covers and stuff like that. So that's it. Thank you. Hopefully that was good for timing. Thanks, Irene.
Great. Thank you very much, Matthew. That's great. We've got quite a few questions, but we're going to keep them for the conversation. So I'm just going to introduce Julie now. Julie Freeman is an established digital artist who works in deep collaboration on art, science, and technology projects to create data-informed art experiences. Her interest is in the use of data as an art material, specifically exploring time-based data from living systems. And her work ranges from site-specific installations to kinetic sculptures to online artworks. Julie holds a PhD in media and art technology from Queen Mary University and an MA in digital art from Middlesex University. She's a TED Senior Fellow and a member of the first Low Carbon Design Institute residency program. And she has exhibited widely in the UK and internationally. Julie, it's great to have you here, and welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Irene, and yes, good to be here. Nice to meet everyone, and great to hear you talk about your work, Matthew. I really enjoyed that. I'm going to, I guess, take a slightly opposing hat to the world of NFTs. Just going to share my screen and see if this is working. All right. So I wanted to talk a little bit today. I mean, I want to actually start with a disclaimer, because I'm not an NFT artist. I am, however, an artist who's worked with experimentally with digital technology and different forms of software for about 25 years now. And so I've always been fascinated and inspired by network technologies, by data, and by how they're used creatively, and how they are sorry, my dog is crying how they're used creatively, and how they're used to kind of represent the systems around us, particularly natural systems, but technological systems as well. So one of the things that I found really interesting about NFTs is that they suddenly burst onto the scene. You know, they trickled along slowly, and suddenly there was a big explosion, and people became really interested in what was going on. And like Irene said, suddenly digital art became labelled in a different way. We'd all been ticking along talking about media art and digital art, and suddenly there was something else that felt like it was kind of infringing on the work we'd been doing for some time. So I should just say that my usual work, which is different to what I'm going to show you today, it uses data as an art material. So I'm particularly interested in using data from living things such as microbes or fish or small naked rodents, and using that to create animations and soundscapes and installations. But for today, I think it's more relevant to talk about a residency I did with the Low Carbon Design Institute, which was the first residence they had last year, just for a month, and it was all done remotely because of the pandemic. And there was about 20 of us. It was hosted by Alexandra Deschamps-Socino, and she convened a whole bunch of different people, artists, curators, designers, builders, together to talk about what low carbon design is. And my particular take on it was, what does it mean to do low carbon activities online, and thinking about the carbon footprint of digital. And so the more I thought about this, the more the word convenience and consequence kept bubbling up in my thoughts. Every time we were talking about what low carbon design would mean, we ended up thinking about things that were not low carbon, and those are the things that had been developed and designed to be convenient. And in the designing of something that is convenient, it had lost its kind of ability to be low carbon. So anything you think about, plastic bags, straws, fruits wrapped in cellophane, faster broadband, faster phone processors, even the water to our homes, all of these things that make our life more convenient have made things less, have a bigger carbon emissions. And so they're convenient for some people that have certain privileges, people that live in certain countries, but they're really absolutely not convenient for other people. And they're definitely not convenient for the world at large when you think about the climate emergency. So these ideas of convenience kept coming up, and then I was started thinking about NFTs, because at the time there's a lot of talk about the carbon footprint of the blockchains involved and the cryptocurrencies that are used to buy and sell stuff. So this is a series of works that just kind of critically, they're like just provocations about what I thought NFTs, what I thought about NFTs could be bringing to the art world. And so they're 12 statements, and the idea was that I wanted to mint them on Hen, like Matthew was just talking about. And the reason I did it, and I think we share this, is that I wanted, as a software developer, I wanted to understand what it means to try and mint something on this particular platform. I chose this platform because, like Matthew said again, it's like a low carbon version. It uses proof of stake instead of proof of work. It still has a carbon footprint. I'm not sure if it's still totally necessary, but it was definitely the best way to go, and the one that I was most morally comfortable with using. And what I wanted to look at was how the exchange happens, what it means for people to be involved. So as well as the kind of classic energy exchange that you think about with cryptocurrencies, there's also this energy exchange of our energy, of human energy, which is about our attention. There's an exchange of data, and then there's the data that is about that attention, and that is what is logged on the blockchain. Somebody's gone, I want to buy this, I'm going to put this here, this is logged, and that is all like a cycle of energy. And so as works are bought and sold, this journey is recorded and time-stamped and priced, and then it leaves a kind of a debris behind. And I was interested in that because it is debris, it's immutable, it stays on the blockchain, it becomes read-only, and then that data is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And that is absolutely fascinating to me. For someone who's worked with data for a long time and who's thinking a lot about data deduplication and how we can remove data from the web, what does it mean for these new systems to be building bigger and bigger? There's a small children's story about the magic porridge pot that just keeps spewing out porridge, and nobody can remember the word to stop the porridge. And it feels a little bit we're like that with data at the moment. So is it convenient, these new systems? Are they convenient? And have they lost the context? This is what it looked like on the platform. So there was 12 artworks. When you tap on one in the gallery, and this is still there, but you can't trade anymore on this platform. It's just kind of it's like a read-only platform. And it asked the collector to collect the NFT and then to immediately let it go. And what I wanted to find out was whether collectors would buy something and then let it go for the same price or swap it straight out. More often than not, they were collected and then put up for a much higher price, which I was kind of disappointed in, because it did make it seem like it was more about whether people could make money out of the works. And I put them up from a really low price. There was something like 30 pence. And you can see who's bought them. And there were some people that I knew that bought them, and then there was people that I didn't know who then I subsequently contacted to say, the work is about letting go of the artwork. Can you please let go? And two of them that replied said they wouldn't let go unless I swapped it with something else. I was like, okay. So it was good to get a little insight of what people were thinking about on the platform. So I whizzed through them, and it just to expose some of my thinking, I guess, around what I think of NFTs and this idea that context is not convenient. And I think in the digital art context, there is no context when people are talking about NFTs. And I've listened to some group discussions on Twitter lately, and it's almost like digital art hasn't existed. And there's been people making algorithmic art for 60 odd years, and that history seems to have been erased from many people's conversations because they're so busy talking about the platform. They're not talking about the context of the artwork and the artists themselves. And I think that's an issue. value the anticipation. This comes from the idea that the value for the collector and even for the artist is this anticipation. And it is valuable because it's exciting. And, you know, that is something that is good about the system. You put something up. Is someone going to buy it? That's exciting. If they do buy it, then that's even more exciting. If they sell it on, is that going to happen? So there's a lot of anticipation, and it is a kind of a bubbly and a dynamic setup ecosystem. Wait for more. There's this kind of element of addiction and gambling within the blockchain and NFT world, and I think that's something that really has to be acknowledged, because you know, when you are creating a series or you are doing editions, then you miss one, maybe you wait and see if the next one comes up. So there's this kind of constant sort of pull towards keeping involved with the platform. And to be honest, like once you have been through the slightly painful procedure of setting up a wallet and buying some cryptocurrency and registering about a zillion different things so that you can actually take part, then you're bought into the process. Do it all slower. This fascinated me, actually, that considering a piece of software is made to manage loads of transactions, that it's all incredibly slow and incredibly inefficient. And for someone building software, if you're a software developer, you aim for efficiency, for elegance, for upgradability, for backward compatibility, all of these kind of tenets of software engineering that are important. And yet with the blockchains, it's slow and it's inefficient. I couldn't quite understand that. I don't think it's good practice for something that is so massive. Throttle with purpose. Again, I was thinking about how you can tempt your collectors, how you can extend the scarcity of your artwork, how you can keep them engaged and keep things moving, and maybe to do that with purpose so that the works become like an extended performance that you are controlling. And back to this idea of convenience, not being context. Just because it's there, it doesn't mean you have to use it. And I think that kind of like, let's hop on to this, the world of NFTs, and let's start minting because it's there. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should, just because it's there. And so the convenient is not necessarily context is really true. There's also issues around privacy. So to do something quickly on the blockchain may be convenient for you, but it reveals, because people can go and look at your transactions and see who's been buying what and for how much, there's an issue of privacy, and they can see the context in that the buyers and sellers are coming from. And this made me laugh the other day when Melania Trump, I think, released some NFTs of some rubbish, and someone looked into the transactions, and it was that they found out that they'd just bought their own NFTs to kind of elevate the price. And that happens time and time again. There's a name for it, but I can't think of it at the moment. So there's a privacy issue. Give away your take. I wanted people to give away what they'd taken and they didn't. That was disappointing. Let it go faster. Again, hold something that is very very small and very cheap, and then just let it go quickly. And again, that didn't happen. Will not copy. This fascinated me even before everyone was talking about right click and save. Why shouldn't you copy? Why can it not be copied? And if you do copy it, then how are you crediting the artist and what's happened? I think that the whole idea of copying, certainly, like Matthew was saying, when collectors or people that are then assembling that art into other exhibitions online, what does that mean? Slow it all down. You're burning the planet with your slow transactions. Make it just. Friction is all about the justice. And I think this is really important to think about how just these systems are. From the top, there's a lot of privilege and power, and at the bottom, it's not very just, where artists are seeing what's happening, and then they're minting, they're paying their gas fees to mint NFTs, and then they're not being bought. And the justice is is unequal. There is not equality in the NFT world. And again, the convenience is not convenience. Over time, it's not going to, I don't think it will stand up over time. So if you're thinking, so this is where I got to this point of, I felt quite critical and quite concerned about everything that was going on. So I started thinking about, if I wanted to put my work on a blockchain, if I was thinking about minting pieces, what are the questions I should be asking myself as an artist that would make it make sense? What would give me the validation to move in that direction? What does it bring to my practice about the way I make things and how I develop? What does it bring to my artistic output? Is it beneficial? Will I reach a wide audience? The audience is massive in terms of NFTs, but who is the audience you want to reach? Is it an alternative audience to the ones that you've got already? Are they diverse, wealthy, influential collectors? What are you looking for beyond just making money, for instance? And will I connect with new peers? And this is what's talked about a lot, is this community of peers where everyone is kind of cycling around, buying and selling amongst themselves. It's a good way to connect with people like that. Will you regret your actions? Are you being authentic? Is the medium even authentic, or is it very transitory? Does minting an NFT add value to your understanding of the world? And what skills are you developing in doing that? And could you do it differently? I think you can still critique a technology, you can critique software, you can critique a platform without necessarily engaging in it once you've understood it properly. And do you care? I mean, there is a certain amount of there's a certain level of whether you want to question yourself to that level. Do you care, and should you care? Does it really matter how much you take part or don't? I think it's important to think about these things if you want to do it. And then this was the 13th artwork, Nevermind, which was obviously Nevermind. I never minted this one. And just to finish off, I think although there's a sort of a quite critical negative take on the wider NFT platforms, there is something inherently really interesting in them. And if you are working with technology and you are working with software and network systems, it's very tempting to understand how NFTs work and what it will mean. But I think to have a kind of that critical approach is essential. And what I wouldn't want to do, and this is the only one that I've done, and I don't think I'll probably go back to it, because I feel like I don't want to take part in something that has been mostly taken over by the capitalist patriarchy. So I'm going to leave it there for questions.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you. That was great. Thank you both, Matthew and Julie, for your brilliant presentations and provocations as well, and many questions that you brought up. I would like to invite also Matthew to come back so we can have a brief conversation. We haven't got a lot of time, but hopefully, we can get started. I just wanted to maybe start also reminding people that they can please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we'll bring them in. But I think you both mentioned ideas around value here as well, and so many. And there was also a comment in the chat from Stasa, I think, talking about artists getting lost in this, in this system, and which is very much what around the conversations that have happened. And Julie, you did mention injustice as well, and in terms of NFTs, and also Matthew before mentioned about control as well, and it is something that I've been kind of feeling very much divided about in terms of the NFT world, and also thinking how much we artists have been criticized in terms of for taking part or for minting work, etc., which again is something that has made me feel a little bit divided in terms, because I've been working with many artists in countries across the world who had no other means to kind of present their work, or like they felt that, you know, these NFTs, or like especially Hikenung and these platforms that you've mentioned, you know, enable them a little bit, you know, to present work, but also to make some money from their work. So I wanted to kind of bring back a little bit this idea of value as well, in terms of like, how do you think that, also because yesterday I should have mentioned Hind, who did here, who gave us a presentation about some research findings for the scene, like in Jordan. And of course, he mentioned that NFTs are illegal in Jordan, for example. And I know many artists here from Jordan have questions in terms of like, how do you start? Where do you go? Like, what platforms you are going with? So I would love to kind of, you know, go back to this question about value in terms of like, you know, how do you think that artists could navigate? Where do they stand in this massive system like that? It is a capitalist system, and it is like sometimes, you know, quite confusing for people, because you know, we have all these conversations about, is NFTs art? Is it not art? What is digital art? Is it just NFTs? So, and as you said very rightly, forgetting the history of like generative art and also digital art, like that has been going on for so many years, decades actually. So yeah, so I would love to hear from you about that. I don't know who wants to start. I will just leave it to you to decide.
Matthew, I feel like I've been talking for ages. Matthew, go.
Yeah, sure. I guess, I mean, it's quite a dense question, really, because there's so many different ways in which you can interpret this word value. Obviously, this obviously NFTs opens up this door to financial value, and I think what I found fascinating from this whole experiment was I never really, you know, really measured my work through its kind of financial value. I never put a price on anything, and you know, there would be the kind of odd time in which I'd have to price something, and it would feel like this kind of really awkward thing. It's like, it's, you know, I'll take this much fee, or this kind of roughly is the value of my time. But within the sort of world of NFTs, you know, the you know, the value of a work is like, you know, precisely tracked. You know, there's actually trackers, there's websites that will track the sort of value of my individual artworks, whether they're going up or down. So it turns a lot of artworks and artists into cryptocurrencies themselves. You know, you start to feel a little bit like you are some sort of coin, and people are like tracking your progress. Like, you know, if you have like you know, if there's kind of growth behind your prices, and I found that's quite a tricky territory. You know, it can be really demoralizing, and yeah, it can kind of be quite painful for some artists, you know, to suddenly see their work in those terms, especially if it somehow they're sort of seen unfavorably by the market. They become part of some sort of scheme to depreciate the value of the work, you know, and I think that can be really harmful and really upsetting. So I think actually we have to have more conversations around other forms of value. You know, what is the cultural value of the work? What is the historical value of some of the artworks that are being shared? You know, sort of, and this again, even those things are quite tricky, because who are the arbiters of that? Who are the gatekeepers of what is, you know, canonized or not? So it becomes, you know, a real difficult conversation to be had, because at some point, you know, I do quite enjoy the sort of crazy frenzy of not having gatekeepers and cultural commentators deciding which artworks need to be seen or not seen, and it's each to their own, and there's this kind of weird kind of mad fight for attention, and you can see a lot of that on Twitter. You know, artists having to sort of really fight for engagement all the time now. Yeah, so it's a really tricky one. I don't think there's a good answer to any of this, but I think it's definitely, value is definitely a key word here in that debate. So thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, I think it's that, you know, the idea of what success looks like and what it means to everybody as an individual is so different. And I think when what the NFT and you know, the Tezos platform is a little bit different, but what the other platforms, what they've done is it's just they've priced, the success is about how much money that you're commanding. And if you're an artist making really thoughtful, really interesting work, like Matthew, your series of caves, you know, they're really considered. You've done a lot of work thinking about those. And then you see some other artworks that are going for hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they're literally, you know, even, I know it's all subjective, but even some of them are just, you know, crap. And, you know, how does that feel if you're kind of trying to compete in that marketplace and all you see is work that of a certain type and a certain kind being valued over and above other stuff? And so I think it's problematic, because it also, you know, history will log the successful stuff, the things that stands out from the crowd, and that will be, you know, the Beeples and the other big works that have sold that are not necessarily even novel to what we've seen go before. It is problematic, and it comes from the whole idea of metrics and social media and, you know, celebrity culture, and celebrities being an influencer is about how much money you earn now. So it's kind of like the conversion of attention to money has become the focus.
Yeah, actually, you bring up an interesting point, which is a lot of the data that is available on the blockchain is the transaction data, so what things have been bought and sold for. So when developers are quickly putting together these tools and these marketplaces, because, you know, a lot of these pop up very, very quickly, the only thing that they have to make a recommendation system is that market data. So instantly, you're creating a whole ecosystem in which, you know, you can only measure one artist against the other depending on like who's got more money in their wallet, or who's, you know, and I've literally found myself, you know, sometimes in ranking systems which are literally ranked by how much money I'm holding in my wallet, which is just crazy, you know, to think that someone can kind of track that and use that data as a metric for success or for further engagement. So in a way, it sort of becomes this cyclical thing where the more money you make, the more likely you're to surface from all that noise and the marketplace. So
those intermediaries, it's so easy just to hack that data. I mean, you can just say, yeah, I've accessed. They can just be like, yeah, access the blockchain. They can just insert into their user interface. Oh, yeah, look, Matthew is the third highest earner of the day, and exactly. That could be arbitrary. Like, who's going to go back and check the actual?
Yeah, and as you said, there's scams where people just buy and sell their own work to sort of, you know, artificially boost those numbers as well. So that's why some of that crap rises to the surface as well.
You make a very good point there, because actually it is, there is like this drive in terms of, like, as you were saying, like celebrity culture, or like, you know, who earns more, etc., which is quite problematic. And again, it goes back to you know, injustice, because of course we know that there is a very big pool of artists that don't earn, like they might be even like losing money from minting and then there's a very small group of artists who earn a lot, and then the whole thing is kind of driven around this. And I'm just wondering also, you know, how do we, if there is a way, you know, like to create a different way in that, or to kind of find an alternative way to navigate that from a cultural or like artistic perspective, in terms of, you know, how do you like build like a community that does things differently, that it doesn't like look at financial value, for example. Or so there were some people also in the chat here, for example, they were asking like, how do you navigate, like how do you know like what to collect, for example, or like where do you start, like what platforms do you go for? And I find these things are like they can be quite also difficult. But again, just to go back to what Julie you said before, it's the other thing that, you know, seemed to happen very quickly with NFTs, that everybody started like getting, you know, going on NFT platforms and minting, which is it's not necessary to do that. You know, you don't have to do that as well. So there's also, it's good to kind of think about like this as well. You know, I don't have to do it actually. I don't need to be part of this.
Yeah. I mean, I've forgotten a question.
Oh no, it was just more like, just thinking, how do you, if you think that there is a way to navigate that, like in terms of like, there is this massive system that is driven by like a financial kind of values and gain. So I'm just thinking like, is there ever any way for like to kind of get a little bit away from that, or like think in a different way?
There was a really interesting moment in time where right at the beginning of Hikik Nook, there was absolutely no data displayed on the interface. So everyone was just randomized. You just didn't have your own profile or name or image of, avatar up on the website. You just had like a number, and everyone just had a number. And it created a very interesting social dynamic in which you really had to sort of click on other people's collections and sort of really kind of like judge things by eye, and you're really kind of forced to appreciate the artwork. And it was just such a golden age because people were collecting, really because they liked certain images or certain artworks. Obviously that kind of lacked some of the other ways in which we contextualize and discuss works, but it became kind of very, very kind of primarily kind of visually determined rather than through stats and pricing and charts and stuff like that. And I think some marketplaces like Versum that's just come out are trying to replicate some of that dynamic. They're creating, for instance, a category where you can make collections. So you basically can curate little mood boards and collections of other people's works, to try and have more ways of, I guess, steering and navigating engagement that isn't just about metrics around popularity and prices and stuff like that. But at the same time, some of the collectors, well, this is kind of a controversial side to this, but some collectors do get really excited about the artist. Obviously, they're sort of biased towards the artist that they have collected from, but they will then try and disseminate more knowledge and share more understanding of the art practices that they're collecting. So I have found that people that have no background in engaging with generative art are suddenly, really reading about Vera Molnar and the early generative art, really to try and sort of understand and better support those artists. So, it's not the end of the world that their way in is through profiteering and creating some sort of profit. It has, eventually some of the more interesting understandings of art practices do make their way into conversation as well.
I don't know. It just makes me think of what it would look like if it was fixed price. To change what would be valued then, like the quantity maybe, or I don't know, if there wasn't that kind of extreme.
Someone should make I mean, a great experiment would be a marketplace where everyone's mint was priced exactly the same. You had no option to raise or lower your prices, and everyone's just like on the same level playing field, and you could only resell it for the same price as well. That'd be kind of more interesting. But
it would be interesting.
Great, thank you both so much. I'm afraid we have to close this session now here, but thank you so much for your brilliant and insightful presentations and provocations as well. And I'm sure we could have stayed here for much longer to go on with this. But thank you, Julie and Matthew. And I'm just going to now introduce the next session, which is talking about curating digital art, and how exploring how art curators, art institutions, and programmers responding to digital art practices. So I would like to invite three brilliant people that we have here today: Hannah Redler, Hose, Tom Hyam, and Khaldun Hijazin. I'm going to start by introducing Hannah, who is going to do the first presentation. And Hannah is a curator and researcher who enjoys bringing together artists and other experts to create projects which raise social, cultural, and ethical questions within the fields of art, data science, and technology. She's a specialist in media art and participatory practice, and she has been working with museums, galleries, universities, and audiences across the world. She's also the director of the Data Sculpture Art program at the Open Data Institute. And she developed here a love of interdisciplinary narratives as head of arts programs at the Science Museum group, where between 1999 and 2014, she curated exhibitions, art interventions and events, and also established a contemporary art collection, including some of the first ever media art acquisitions by a national museum in the UK. Hannah, we're very pleased to have you here. The floor is yours. Welcome and looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And you have saved me about 30 seconds with the good bio. So I'm just going to try to share my screen and do it properly. I haven't done a PowerPoint share for a long time. So let me make sure I've done this right. Is that, can you see all
yes,
right?
Perfect, yes.
Brilliant, brilliant. So I'm afraid I'm going to read from a document. It's lovely to be here. I'm sorry I can't see all the people who are watching, and I would love to hear from people in the Q&A. But I think that some of the biggest challenges to working with digital art in all its myriad forms have been hinted at already in the last conversation, which is recognizing that it has a very long, rich and varied history. Discovering and advocating for its connections and its relationships with other and more mainstream art histories, that is work that's ongoing, and there's a lot of work to do in that field, but some really interesting things going on by different researchers. Another challenge is having the right technical support. So it was no mistake that I was able to commission and acquire digital art, software art for the Science Museum in London, because the Science Museum has a computing collection and it has engineers on staff who help support things. And originally the conservation policies that I was able to work with were created for the computing collection, although I had to modify it for art. And that wasn't something that was available at the time. You know, I'm talking 22 years ago, for other major art museums. And you need sort of know-how across all the teams involved in a project if you're commissioning and collecting digital art. But I think one of the most important things is keeping an open mind to the various evolutions, which NFT is a perfect example of that. You know, digital is an evolutionary, unstable, evolving, developing field, and we have to always remind ourselves that it's not fixed in time, it's not fixed in media. So I'm going to use the time I've got to talk you through a really rapid, potted history of digital art. It's not exhaustive in terms of types. It's definitely not exhaustive in terms of artists or regions. But I hope it will give you a bit of a flavour about how things have evolved since the first computer art in the 1950s. And after that, I'll give you a little bit of tips on commissioning digital art and some of the challenges of collecting, which will continue, I hope, in the conversation. Okay, so might move that. Do you mind if I close the my face with the shared screen? Is that okay, Irini?
Yeah, that's fine. Don't worry.
Great.
Yes.
So the thing I wanted to point out with my art slide is there is just the most massive range of work that comes under digital art and new media. And one of the really important things when we think about what digital art is to kind of consider which era we're talking about and where in history that particular art sits. Because digital art, software art, media art go hand in hand with developments in industry and with the new technologies of the time. So the curator, Christian Paul, has said, you know, media art requires, sorry, I was just seeing this.
Oops, Hannah, you're on mute now.
Really classy.
Okay.
Brilliant. Okay, so I've got the words that I was going to say written on the screen, which is from Christian Paul, that media art requires media literacy. New media could never be understood from a strictly art historical perspective, and by new media she also means digital media. The history of technology and media sciences plays an equally important role in this art's formation and reception. And the scholars and curators, Beryl Graham and Sarah Cook, have really summarized digital art, media art loosely very well by describing it as something that exhibits any or all three of the behaviors of interactivity, connectivity, computability in any combination. So starting with analog computers, computer art kicked off in the 1950s and explored new aesthetic possibilities, processes and connections between sound, vision and code. I'll say no more about that, but we could go on for hours. Jumping over a few key moments, installation art, software art and telematic art emerged around the late 80s, 1990s and early 2000s, and are unified by embodying a mixture of the following qualities. They are interactive. They are often multi-user. They made new gallery they brought about new gallery behaviors. They questioned the experiences and biases and capabilities of different technologies and questioned our place in the technologically mediated landscape. They were often playful, and I think that that's one reason why there was a lot of resistance actually within mainstream contemporary art, museums and galleries and art worlds to this work. The playfulness sort of belied the serious critical questions underneath it all, and the conceptual work of the code. You know, a lot of the artists were writing their own software at the time, perhaps more than nowadays, because you simply couldn't do it if you didn't at the time. If you couldn't code, you needed someone on your team who could at least. That wasn't authoring software, which is so easily accessible now. And it brought together computers, computer code, cameras, capture cameras, projectors, audio, speakers, networks. So a lot of these works are created out of systems. And some absolute masterpieces were certainly created. But what we saw is a lot of critics in more mainstream art world questioning its sensibility and raising questions about signature, authorial presence, singularity and gloss. And what really interests me about that is when we come to the NFT conversation, this is where we are able to ascribe signature, authorial presence and create a form of scarcity. So it's really interesting how those issues seem to matter so much in this conversation. Net art began to emerge from around 1994 when a network of international artists working on often really low-tech machines and with very low bandwidth and limited internet access started to recognize the net as a third space, a space where new rules could be created and new forms of practice and activism could be enacted. And these were created to be experienced online. They were created outside of the gallery and art world structures, outside of the art market. They were immaterial, though people are finding ways to collect them now. They dealt with connectivity, global reach. They were often about being democratic, the democratizing new media tools that allowed anyone to have a role in mass media communications, for example. They were often user unfriendly, so they were challenging corporate assumptions about interface design and human-machine interaction. And for anyone who wasn't there, I was there in the early 1990s, when you looked at early websites, people were trying to make them look like, you know, marble stones or something, trying to sort of look like, you know, the physical built world. It was very strange. So net art had a really important role to sort of shape a new visual language for network culture as well. Post-internet art is a lot later. I don't know. Oh dear, sorry. Is a lot later, coming around sort of 2006, thereabouts. And it's a vexed term. A lot of people sort of have concerns about the term. I think the moment's probably past, but we are still in a point. The thing that it described at the time it was coined, I think, by Marissa Olson, is this moment in the mid-1990s where young artists who had sort of grown up with the infant World Wide Web, which Tim Berners-Lee had just sort of given to the world in 1989, had grown up with this invention and were creating work as people who were, you know, born digital. And so it's internet aware or post-internet art captures art made by a generation of artists who grew up with it, not before the internet. And it did become a slightly troubled, buzzy buzzword, which has been rejected by some practitioners who were at the time described as post-internet arts. But even though it's really slippery, as many of these terms are, I think it's a recognizable moment, and I think it's quite an important moment when we recognize through the practice of young and emerging artists that we needed to stop othering digital and network culture in art, to recognize that we exist in hybrid network space and our cultural products reflect that. So I call participatory art, I recognize participatory art as a very important part of the digital art history, even though participatory art has been going on since the 1960s, often with no whiff of digital in any way, shape or form. There were new tools in the 1960s, such as portable video recorders and, technologies like citizens band radio, which actually came about in the 1940s, that again reference this democratizing nature of new communication tools, including digital, and they've always appealed to artists. And connected to the democratizing nature of new tools are the kind of community art histories, which themselves are rooted in the civil rights movement and connect to lots of other activist movements. So participatory art has really found many, many channels through digital technology. And how I would describe that is projects involving community groups in the processes, production or realization of artworks, or with or by artists. And they often, as I've said, harness the democratizing qualities of new technologies and involve sharing artistic skills, where the act of collaborating and co-producing, and as Furtherfield would say, doing it with others, are key. So the images that I've got here are from a program of projects that I devised at the Science Museum, where I invited different participatory artists who worked with digital technology in different ways to work with a group of young people you can see here, who spent a day each with each different artist making work that they then had on exhibition in the museum. And that's a tiny slice of a really, really broad practice.
Hannah, sorry to interrupt you. Just a reminder of a couple of minutes left.
Yes,
Okay.
yes, don't worry.
Thank you.
Architectural installation art, participatory art comes at a variety of scales. The larger scale of digital arts practice, what we might call architectural installation, brings about some really spectacular and sophisticated installations that are global scale. I can't rush through a history of digital art without mentioning data art, obviously. And although it nestles into many of the other types, data has always been at the heart of many of these systems. I think a key thing which we recognize at the Open Data Institute through Julie Freeman's work, who founded the Data as Culture Art program, is that data is an art material and has an increasing influence on the way we get to know, shape and reflect the world. And the artists recognize there's no such thing as no bias in technology, that notions of data need to be questioned about whether it's reliable, factual and informational. So that brings us into digital art now. What is the new media? Newborn digital forms continue to emerge now with staggering computational processing behind them, and the potential for increasingly sophisticated sets and display options. And although low tech remains a highly charged aesthetic and creative space, we're seeing high-tech things like VR, AI environments, NFTs, blockchain, etc. And we've talked about NFTs in the past program, but there's a really interesting question between people recognizing them as a radical new format that redistributes agency, control and power, or to artists, or a cynical attempt to pervert the infinitely reproducible natural qualities of digital to create financially lucrative digital scarcity. So there's a question about that. So I think we want to ask some questions about, what are the key questions we need to be asking about these things? It's still an open book, if you like. The other thing I've seen happening in recent times is artists working with digital technology, really reframing narratives. So when you've got the potential for radical democratization of representation, pressing up against the frankly frightening homogenization of increasingly powerful prediction and nudging algorithms, artists are considering the capabilities and influence of network culture and identity resistance, the environment, visual culture, material culture, and our very notion of the real world. And so that's raising a lot of questions in a lot of areas, and digital technology's got a big role to play in that. So after 30 years in this game, what tips can I offer people who want to work with digital art? So the first thing is to be aware of the histories, but not necessarily defined by them. Notice that new technology is always changing, and this affects the budget and the conceptual issues. Be clear where the art lies and don't compromise on this. And it could be anywhere in the system. You know, the art might be the sort of software an artist uses. It might be just the content. It could be computer form, whatever. Technical expertise always helps. Treat each project on a case-by-case basis, and remember that artists' uses of technology are very likely to extend or subvert the intended function. Writing good briefs is important. If you have a process-based project, build in time to review the process and to think about where the project's going. You may need to sort of adjust some of your assumptions on that. If you are exhibiting media works, it's a team effort. It takes a lot of people for successful delivery, so good lines of communication are important. And do loads of testing and request operation and maintenance manuals from artists with delivery. But I think, have I just read the wrong information? I think I might have read the wrong information out to you with the wrong slide. I'll give you that slide. No, I've deleted that slide. Never mind. I've given you some information that isn't reflected on the image that I've given you. Right.
You gave us some great information.
Good information.
Don't worry
Brilliant.
about that yet.
Yes, but then I'll quickly say to this slide that the collecting preserves the history as well as the individual works, that we can't rely on the industry for backward compatibility. So whatever you collect always needs some help from conservators. So I've put a list here of some of the leaders in the digital preservation field: Pip Lawrenson at Tate, Dragan Espenscheid at New York-based Rhizome, and John Ippolito, who developed the variable media questionnaire. But two things I just want to say before I shut up is that I have started to think of new media artworks as more like animals than objects. So they evolve, they change, and they might die. But taking risks and imagining new forms of support for artists is really, really important. I can't overstress that. So I think a lot more of this history would have been captured and collected if organizations had been prepared to take more risks. And I would love to see that continuing, because it's obvious we are going to have more and more new forms as we go forward. Thank you
so much, Hannah. That was brilliant. Thank you very much. And a very much needed also reminder about the going back in time and all the history and the moments that you mentioned. So thank you very much for that. I'm sorry if I have to remind speakers about like the time left. It's because we're running a little bit late, but I would like to welcome now our next speaker, Tom Hyam, who is a creative director and producer working with artists, developers, designers, arts organizations, and policymakers all over the world, and to produce ambitious artworks and creative projects. And Tom is currently creative director of York Mediale, a brand new biennial arts festival, which brings world premiere commissions from leading artists to the city of York. And collaborators and clients have included Arts Council England, British Council, Innovate UK, Nesta, Digital Economy, and Future Cities Catapult, Hyper Island and Sound, National Football Museum, and many, many more. Tom is also a fellow of Salzburg, a global forum for young cultural leaders, and CLOR's Emerging Leaders program. Tom, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Irini, and sorry for that lengthy bio, everybody. I realise how ridiculous it sounds hearing it back, but thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to speak, and how to follow Hannah. Crikey, that was an incredible presentation. I feel like I just got an extra MA, so thank you very much, Hannah. So yeah, my name's Tom. I'm a curator and producer of digital art, and have been in various different kind of roles around festivals and production and curation since, well, for about 18 years now. Currently working in York at the Mediale, which is shifting from being a biennial festival to being a year-round kind of creative production and curation company. So working kind of where projects take us. I've got a few slides to show you, so I'm just going to share my screen. And yeah, please do ask any questions in the chat, and hopefully we can find the time to get to them. Hopefully you can see that okay. So yeah, to start off with, I can't touch the sides of the historical context and rigor and depth that Hannah has just given you, beyond saying how refreshing it is to be in a Zoom room, albeit a room, but a Zoom room, full of people who understand that digital art wasn't invented in 2014 by Google. So that's lovely to hear. It's refreshing to be in with like minds in that sense. To give some context of how and in what way we've been able to create projects in the UK at the moment, I think we're very lucky in the UK. I think we're in a great position, and there's a really dynamic and vibrant sector of artists in the country who have patchy institutional support, very, very patchy beyond individuals like the individuals you've been hearing from today and yesterday. They are in a lot of cases, the exception, sadly, in their bigger context, whether it's a gallery or a performance space or even a funding body. It might sound like the UK has it completely figured out and we've all already got there, and I'm not sure that's always the case, but that's the kind of battle we're fighting. I guess, yeah, my sort of starting point with these with the development of projects and the development of festivals is to take a step back from what digital art is, and for me it's not interpretation, which you might hear about it in the context of a lot of heritage and museum organizations. It's not marketing, it's not cost saving, or it's not a magical way to multiply your audience figures, but rather it's a fundamental revolution in the expectations, behaviors, concerns, tools, access, pressures and challenges facing society. It's fundamental. And again, I don't want to preach to the converted, because I know a lot of you will understand that and kind of think, yes, but I'd go on to say I have a confession in that I'm not interested in technology. I know this session is being recorded, and hopefully that won't cause me to be cancelled or lose a project or something like that. But for me, in supporting and in developing and contextualizing digital artworks, the digital is just the useful categorization, and often where interestingly used, the stimuli or the context or the material with which the work is made. But I mean, I heard just a little quote to back that up. I heard recently in the museum sector, somebody very, very senior and very well regarded in the museum sector said to me, "Used thoughtfully and only as a vehicle for interpretation, rather than the interpretation itself, technology such as augmented reality can open up new experiences to a wide variety of audiences." So you can tell there's like 3 levels of caveat to that statement. As long as you're very careful, and the technology is only how you get to the information, not the information, then technology has some interesting, but in this case, augmented reality has some interesting affordances. I just flat out disagree with that, I'm afraid. And to me, that's the dividing line between technology and art, or even design and art. For me, my favorite works are often where the technology used is either invisible or it's certainly insignificant, and the concept and the message of the work that the artist is trying to make stands kind of as the main message. So yeah, I really just see technology as tools and material, and something that we organizations like FutureEverything and like mine and like Hannah's and like Julie's work with technology critically, and I think that's where artists can be the real sort of canaries in the coal mine. There's a legendary quote from, I think it's from Zach Lieberman, somebody will know or correct me where I'm wrong, that digital artists are the R&D departments of the advertising industry. You know, so that's where I find it really interesting, where artists kind of are saying something with the technology or exploring the boundaries or testing a technology when it interacts with society, which I find an interesting framing. So the established arts infrastructure in the UK certainly is predominantly geared towards more traditional art forms. And there are few and far between, as I was saying earlier, kind of supporters or fully literate kind of supporters for our work in where funding might be sourced and partnerships might be sourced. But I think in terms of the younger generation around digital art practice and digital art sort of creation as well, perhaps moving past that old paradigm of categorization. We're desperate. The Arts Council in the UK is always desperate to put people in a box, whether it's theatre or dance or music. Everything digital is combined arts, whatever that means. So there isn't a category. There is no funding formally by our in our structure for digital art in the UK. There is funding for combined arts. So I think what is important for us to do is to articulate our value in a much more compelling way, and not just economically. So not just in terms of teaching people coding skills, not just in terms of the vague and nebulous creative economy of the magic pill that's going to fix every country's economy, but to articulate the real value of creating with technology, and the real value that artistic experiences and artistic expression in the digital space can offer. And I think when we can do that, we can source support and partnership from a much wider variety of places. So be it arts funders, city councils, commercial technology brands or advertising companies, transport bodies, community trusts and foundations. I think a lot of the more interesting practice is coming from the non-usual places. Not necessarily, you don't have to be a big respected contemporary art institution to really understand and really support this practice, in my experience. So coming on to what we're up to at the moment at the Mediale, and I apologize in advance for the name. I didn't come up with it. It was there when I arrived. It's a made-up word combining media and biennale. So, take from that what you will. And my first effort was to try and change the name, but it was already too locked in, so I couldn't do that. In my experience certainly over the last kind of 10, 15 years, the digital art space certainly in Western Europe is very, very dominated by male, masculine, angular, sort of dark, techno-led white men behind laptops as a sort of aesthetic and as a culture and as a dynamic. I'm not interested in that. The technology-led curatorial framings I find really a bit limiting, perhaps, and not that exciting to an audience outside of our kind of little filter bubble that we live inside. So we try and work towards projects that are much softer, much more about love and connection and society and humanity. They feel a hell of a lot more urgent and a hell of a lot more important to our society right now than whether we should explore the potential for virtual production and machine learning, or because it's virtual production and machine learning. Everybody gets very excited about the new shiny thing. I remember going to South by Southwest, for example. It was about 4 years ago now, and it was a VR car boot sale. Every company had a bunch of headsets and various kind of wares on offer, and 99.9% of the stuff that you could see in those headsets was just awful, just terrible. It felt like a gold rush, but without anybody understanding what gold was or where it was or whether it had any value. So those kind of technically driven things aren't really what gets us going at Mediale anyway. A couple of sort of developments that we're working on. We've shifted, as I say, to try and support the digital arts sector in the UK and more globally. We've shifted to a more agency model. I know agency is a dirty word in the art sector, but to support a number of artists to a much deeper level over the longer term. So to develop projects that ideally are created and then premiere locally and certainly in the UK, and then support them to go on and tour the world. So we've been doing that over the last few years, and have a few works that are under sort of longer term development, which we're very excited about. And just to mention a couple of them. The first one is with Marshmallow Laser Feast, which I think featured at some point in Hannah's amazing presentation just now. And we developed a huge project with them in a cemetery in Coventry. That's also an incredible arboretum right in the middle of the city of Coventry, which is is the city of culture for 2021/2, and it's an incredible place right in the city centre. So a fully immersive experience with not a headset in sight that takes you all around the forest, and the entire intention of that work is and was to explore the connections between our human bodies and the natural world, and to sort of break down some of those barriers. It's kind of a meditative experience that, and we're working to continue to tour that in different ways over the next months and hopefully years. Just some grabs from that. It's hugely high-end scientific data that we work with that MLF work with to map oxygen and hemoglobin flow through the lungs, through the body. Working with partners in Germany called Fraunhofer Mavis. Really wonderful, kind of incredible resolution data, but also always with a sort of spirit. They're basically hippies with technological skills, MLF, and I think they'd be happy to be described as that. Sorry, Barney, if you hear this and you disagree, but hey. I've got a couple of videos that I'm going to skip through because I know we're short on time. But also a second one that we're really proud of is a piece that we made during the pandemic that is still ongoing, but during 2020, called People We Love, which is essentially a video portraiture piece. So it's made with the community of the location in which it's shown, and people are invited to sit for their portrait and bring along a picture of somebody that they love. We never see and never ask to see who that picture is or ask anything about that image, and they're taken through again a meditative experience where they then sorry kids where they then are filmed incredibly high resolution, incredibly high frame rate, literally gazing upon that picture. So you as a viewer of the video portrait are looking into the eyes of somebody who's looking at a picture of somebody that they love. It's a really quite powerful experience that the artist is very keen to fall into the background of, so more on that one showing around the world soon. It's currently about to open in Pittsburgh in the US, so excited about that.
I'm sorry to interrupt. You've got about a minute left. Is that okay?
Awesome. Last one. This one is called Absent Sitter, which is a research project really with the University of York and incredible Elizabeth Bernholtz, who's under the performing name Gazelle Twin, exploring. Elizabeth became pregnant recently, and we've worked with her a number of times over the years, and she found we were talking a lot about kind of the use of technologies and collaborations with different immersive practices, and how in the performance space and in the certainly as a musician, if you can't play live, it's very difficult to make a living. And so if you have caring responsibilities or very life-limiting physical disabilities, how could you, or if you are heavily pregnant or you have a 2-month-old baby, how can you go on tour of European music venues and earn your living? So we created an experience with her called the Absent Sitter, and as you can guess, Elizabeth is absent from the experience, but it's all crafted around the communal experience that you have with the other people attending. So that's a really exciting kind of line of research for us. So yeah, just to say thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity. Just a few brief project examples, and yeah, look forward to any conversation that we're able to fit in time for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom. That was great. Thank you again. So I'm going to quickly do an intro to our next speaker, and who is going to chair also the conversation. So Khaldoun Hijazin is a Jordanian visual artist and cultural manager, and he's currently working as the director of art and cultural programs at the Jordan National Gallery of Fine Arts. So Khaldoun also worked for several years as a faculty lecturer at the School of Arts and Design at the University of Jordan. And he received his BA in visual arts from the University of Jordan in 2010, followed by an MFA from SMFA at Tufts University in Boston in 2014. And in addition to his artistic practice, he has developed a complementary practice as a researcher and curator of workshops and exhibitions that aim to cast new light on the varied cultural and sociopolitical conditions of his community, both locally and beyond. Welcome, Khaldoun. I don't know if you're also sharing any slides. I think you were going to give us your perspective, and then we can move into the conversation. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Irene, and thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure and delight to be part of this wonderful forum. And thanks to Hannah and Tom for this encyclopedic and, of course, very insightful and thought-provoking presentations. I don't think I would have a lot to add in terms of historical context or most recent advancements in the field of digital art, but maybe through my presentation, I would be able to frame and capture what are the realities for an institution in Jordan known as the main institution for championing fine arts in Jordan, but not just in Jordan, but also in the region. So it would circle, I hope, back to some of the questions about where do institutions stand and what is being done to kind of advance practices in digital art and new media and so on. So I will jump straight to the to sharing my presentation, and we can have a fair amount of time for the discussion to follow. All right. So like Irene said, my background is an artist and academic. I've taught art. And only for the past 2 years, I've joined the Jordan National Gallery as a cultural art and cultural director. I think to kind of frame the experience of the Jordan National Gallery vis-a-vis shifting realities, let's say, of museum practices and art practices of the 21st century, it would be worth mentioning that I mean, a lot has changed because the National Gallery was founded in 1980, and it was kind of working from a democratic policy and you know, theories of misrepresentation. It kind of was the impetus was to kind of really create a balance between Western and Eastern art and be a beacon to champion art from the global South. And till now, like over 42 years of its journey, it has been able to house 2,000 around or over 2,800 artworks, including primarily and most predominantly in plastic arts, sculpture, ceramics, painting. But only recently, since the beginning of the century, it has the institution has changed perspectives in terms of the kind of art it acquires, but not only that, also in terms of its position and dynamics with interacting with stakeholders, the local art scene and its players. So I think, I don't know if you can get to see my entire screen, because I'm getting the tab here.
Yeah, we can see the navigation slides in the.
Yeah, and the screen is full.
Yes, we can
right?
see your whole screen. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, great. So the National Gallery, around 5 years ago, started to kind of change fundamentally in the way it views its role in the community and in society. And you know, a lot of that brings to mind the prophetic works and critical theories that we've left with from the past century. I mean, here you can see the name of Walter Benjamin, who in the 30s had this prophetic essay, seminal essay, talking about the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, which is really a very critical essay and a thought-provoking piece to make us think about what do we lose when we move away from the unique, authentic form of art to more reproducible, more you know, reproduction, mechanical, mass dissemination, and so on. And it also made the Jordan National Gallery to kind of again consider, like, is art an object that is housed and collected and acquired and preserved, or it could be a sensory experience open to a multiplicity of possibilities, as long as it stays within our engaging the sensory realm of our audiences. And of course, the idea of the white cube and having to, you know, not be gatekeepers of art, but also have a more proactive role in the society, how to, you know, adapt to the changing definition of the museum in the 21st century with digitization, democratization, globalization of art and culture. And also, as things have advanced and practices have advanced, a stagnant institution would really fight to stay relevant. And for that, it would need to make this fundamental change from being a nicety to a necessity to artists. And of course, with digitization, there's many democratic and progressive outcomes to be harnessed through these technologies and interacting with larger networks of the local and global community. So we've been trying, like I was saying, for the past 5 years. It's our achievements in digital art or progress in digital art as an institution is still in its infancy, but we didn't want to spend years to learn about digital art and then start producing. No, we thought we'd take a model of learning by making and by co-producing with local stakeholders and art practitioners. So we changed the direction and started to have and invite mentors and you know, create cross-cultural programs where new media artists and mentors and practitioners are interacting and mentoring emerging promising emerging artists who are really willing and thirsty to test and experiment with new mediums. And some of these artists and emerging artists that the Jordan National Gallery has catered to through these programs have been former students who've been classically, you know, trained to stand behind the easel and work, you know, with this very defined mediums and definitions in traditional art. So to make that happen, of course, the changes were made in our infrastructure and how much we allocate to be you know, well-equipped and prepared for these digital programs and new media workshops, exhibitions, and so on. So that included, you know, purchasing devices. Like as you can tell, probably we're still learning and adapting as we go, depending and according to the needs and challenges and hopes that we have as an institution. And there's a very interesting shift in the dynamics in art, not just in Jordan, but I think it's a global thing, that this reverse in dynamics. The museum is no longer the originator or the responsible for telling people what art or what they should think is art, but now there's been a reverse with art, you know, art-led initiatives, collectives, and really artists who are pushing the boundaries. They have they have been, you know, posing this question to museums of what can we do to kind of invite these people and these practitioners, active practitioners, to redefine what art is and present it to the public. So there's a shift from that authoritative originator kind of role of the institution towards a more democratic and horizontal approach with stakeholders. So yeah, going back, infrastructure has changed, and we've been also trying to work with new features for the usual, you know, touring experience in the National Gallery, where we incorporated QR codes that you can use for guides to kind of guide you through the different displayed artworks. Our website has been revitalized to kind of include archival and high quality images of the permanent collection, which is a milestone considering where we were at in these technologies, in addition to, you know, picking up the pace with, you know, virtual platforms and incorporating them in our, you know, group public lectures, group workshops and programs of different sorts, which have been pretty helpful during the time of the pandemic. So in our National Gallery, the permanent collection, as you can see, these would be examples of digital art. The first artwork that you can see on the left-hand side is Walls of Gaza by prominent Palestinian artist Layla Shawa. It was produced via digital means of digital printing on canvas, and that's the first piece to enter the collection that has digital, you know, processes in its making, and it was acquired in 1996. So that would be the first acquired artwork to involve digital technologies, and then later on, you know, we acquired video works and you know, artworks produced by digital means and technologies. As an example, Khalid Ramadan, Psychic Identity, which when we first collected, it was in the format of a DVD back then, and now we kind of changed that into a more soft copy in our storages and digital storages. And another example is this international artist from Korea, Joik Lee. His work is part of the permanent collection, which is a video performance piece that incorporates technological sensory devices that kind of read brain activities and are used as an integral part of the content of the artwork. Other instances and you know, moments, thought to present to you some of the images and impressions of these cross-cultural exchange programs and co-learning workshops. Sorry, someone is mic, so.
No,
okay.
I think that's fine that somebody had like the mic on. Khaldun,
Okay.
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Just a reminder, we have like a 1 minute left, if that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. So I will not take longer than that, and would be excited to go into the conversation and and you know, make use of having such great fellow guest speakers. But these are some instances of works produced by emerging artists, and they were experimental, incorporating sensors and light installations and digital technologies and so forth. And just to cut through really quickly, we're glad in 2020, just after the break of the pandemic, the International Open Media Art Festival by OMAF in Korea has been hosted at the Jordan National Gallery. For the first time, we host a dedicated exhibition for open media arts, and it kind of curated, different works by Korean and regional artists and Jordanian artists. On the right side, you see Tawfiq Dawi is an emerging Jordanian promising artist whose work he works with digital sculpture and it's a video moving sculpture. You know, like I said, these platforms that we've been using to conduct workshops and co-learning opportunities for artists, I don't want to take too much time, but is really, I'd like to highlight Factory platform, which in its last program dedicated for public art projects has initiated the Laboratory of the Future, which was a program co-organized with Goethe Institute and the French Institute. And it gave birth to a new collective in Jordan called the Remote Closeness Team. And you can follow them on Instagram. They have the Remote Closeness Project, which was launched at the Jordan National Gallery of Fine Arts. It kind of talked about and addressed you know, the importance of inclusivity and using digital means to reach wider audience and less privileged audience across the country. So I invite you to see more of that project that we're proud to have been part of through the dedicated Instagram account of the Remote Closeness Team. We have a lot of, you know, these baby steps so far, but we're on a little staff, not having great financial means. We still want to continue on to advancing into these new forms of art, but our strategies and plans and prospects, they really require a good and fair amount of cultural funds and you know, other factors to kind of help technological factors and having access and knowledge for managing technological resources. Hannah mentioned having teams in her institute who are engineers and experts. Maybe we don't have the capacity to have that in-house yet at the Jordan National Gallery, but we look forward to you know, take little steps to achieving a more sustainable capacities to work around digital art, and also have digitization of the Jordan National Gallery resources, archives, and data in general. Sorry, I probably have crossed the time, but I would like to take the word.
Thank you so much, Khaldun. That was great. And it's so exciting to hear about your brilliant work at the National Gallery. Yeah, it's brilliant to have your perspective as well. I would like to invite Hannah and Tom to come back on stage so we can have the conversation. And Khaldun, I will leave you to chair this. I'm sorry to say that we don't have a lot of time. We have about just over 10 minutes so it has to be like a very brief conversation, but hopefully, yes. But I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Thank you so much, all of you. I'll stay in the background and just remind you about the time.
Sounds good, Irini. Thank you. I would like to take the few moments we have left to pose this question to Tom and Hannah. And citing a great article that I've really enjoyed learning about, through which I learned about Roy Ascott, progenitor of telematic art. And in the 90s, he had an essay titled, "Is There Love in the Telematic Embrace?" And it kind of addresses and gets straight to the fears and intimidation with, you know, traditional audiences and practitioners of art, who to quote a little bit, have these deep-seated fears of machine coming to dominate the human will, and of technological formalism erasing human content and values. How do you, in terms of in your own perspectives and experiences as curators, and how do you work with those fears and expectations? Sometimes choosing to go with hyper new media could pose, you jeopardize, you know, the institution's relation with traditional audiences. And to answer Roy Ascott, is there love in the telematic embrace?
After you with that one, Hannah. You go first.
Okay. Quick answer is yes, but I think that what's really significant is that when I started working in the field, you know, 30 years ago, there was great suspicion of the technological field, particularly in the UK. We, with painting being such a dominant history here, there was a sort of sense that working the traditional fine arts, which I trained in paint as a painter, is a sort of hard-won route to serious art. And I think that's changed absolutely by now. But I think that today, particularly after the pandemic, people have used the network so much. And if you look at young people who have their phones all the time, this is the prosthetic device for most humans. I think that people have really begun to recognize the digital field and the network space as space where they live and love and feel. And I think it wasn't necessarily like that. It wasn't like that 30 years ago. But what artists did, like Roy Ascott and other artists, is they created scenarios that connected people, and they created scenarios that moved people and made people think and feel. But I think seeing your program and the work that you've done with people, the Future Lab, it really demonstrates that love and that humanity and that ability to connect that's really significant. I would also say, when I talked about engineers, that was for the sort of work that one had to make 20, 30 years ago. It's not so necessary today. I mean, I thought your program looked astonishing.
Thank you, Hannah. It's modest steps, but you have to start somewhere.
It's the risk-taking I love about your program.
Thanks. I'll leave the chance to Tom to respond to Roy Ascott's big question.
Just to add to that, and I love that as a kick-off question. Thank you so much, Khaldun, because the love and humanity that we're talking about, and the connection and the actual people that you're working with, as Hannah's just mentioned, that's the important bit for me. Like I always try and differentiate and it's very reductive and simplistic, but I sometimes differentiate. There's the real like feverish desire for scale and spectacle in a lot of this work sometimes, particularly from commissioners and partners who maybe aren't as literate as the folks in this room. But I struggle sometimes where spectacle dominates, because the experience is so superficial, it's so forgettable. You've literally forgotten it by the time you've got home. And the analogy I would give is, I used to work a lot in film and in cinema. And if you come out of you go to see a film with a friend, and you come out afterwards, and one turns to the other usually and says, "So what did you think?" And the other one goes, "It was pretty good, nicely shot." Then the film has not been successful. It's not provoked anything in you. And a lot of those kind of spectacle experiential works, they're kind of like, "Oh, it was nice. It made me go wow momentarily," but then I didn't think anything deeper of that, and there was no emotion or humanity built into it, and it was kind of very cold in that respect. So I think in the same way with any other art form, good work is good and bad work is bad, and it exists in this field too, I guess. Sorry to be overly simplistic.
But the concept and the content play such a role in that, to come up with a really good idea and find the solutions to manifest that idea is as important, working with technology, and being mindful that, you're right, Tom, being mindful that the spectacle can be a quick win, and avoiding that quick win and making it clear what the artist's intention and what the artist's intervention has been goes a long way.
And even sometimes the opposite of scale and spectacle invites people closer to it, almost kind of physically and anthropologically. You pull people in a little bit more. If you go, wow, blam, people stand back and then walk away. But there's something about the dexterity of the emotional weight of a work and the emotion, the sort of power that's much more appealing, I find.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, it's hard, to kind of have definite answers, as these technologies and forms are still evolving and emerging. So it's really hard to frame them or to kind of pin them down. But I think there's a differentiation to be made about, works incorporating digital means and works taking the parameters and possibilities of digital media to kind of elevate and multiply the possibilities for a human sensorial experience. I mean, this is what I like about cybernetic and telematic art, as branches of digital art, is that they even in what they propose, it really is critical on a fundamental level, dealing with histories of enlightenment and Newtonian ideas of engaging in the universe. I take instances of artworks that really change, utterly change the not just the definitions of art, but the definitions of human experience.
It's interesting you say that. One of the first artworks that I worked on as a young curator was Paul Sermon's Telematic Dreaming, and we did a version of it in a museum in Bradford that was called the National Museum of Photography at the time. What it involved was 2 remote locations where one party of people would be projected onto a sofa or a bed in a different location. And so real people would have to interact with the projected person. And of course, that took away language. So it necessitated non-verbal means of communication, and all sorts of behaviors occurred. So the first behaviors were kind of sex and violence, not literally, but play, pretending to hit each other with pillows and stuff. But over time, he got a lot of documentation of how people reacted. It forced a new form of communication. And I think it's works like that that make us consider how we are altered by digital space, by network space. I had my first moment in a room of many people this morning at a meeting, a big meeting, and it was astonishing how different it was after 2 years online. Just, the sensory difference. And I think it's really interesting how artists working with new media have kind of mined the emotional content, mined the human requirements of these technologies to stop that.
I can't agree more, indeed. I don't know, Irene, are we taking you too off the planned schedule and timing?
We have a couple. Yeah, I think if we can close in like maybe a minute or 2. I'm so sorry for that. I wish. Yeah. It's so frustrating because I wish we could stay here all night, and because there's so many things that you can talk about which are amazing.
Thank you, Irene. Yeah, I would leave probably the last reflection for Tom to kind of reflect on this idea and differentiation of of art that uses digital means versus art that transforms the very definitions of human experience, whether it's a past project you worked on or
I'm always drawn to the and I know kind of most people are drawn to the work of forensic architecture at the moment, in terms of not all digital art needs to be or can be journalism, and not all of their work is straight journalism, but just the rigor and depth and technical dexterity and aesthetic kind of approachability that they're using in terms of exploring global injustices and global kind of human rights abuse. I find it like really, really compelling. It's not superficial, and it's not kind of it's very weighty work, and their recent commission in Manchester and all of the political ramifications of that being temporarily closed and then reopened again were just fascinating for the art world itself, I think, and the bravery of us as curators and institutions, and the sort of the principles by which we stand are quite pressured by those. And then just a couple of other really, really quick references. Just Hannah, as you were talking, it made me think about a work by a really incredible media artist friend of mine called Adi Vagenecht, and it's optimization of parenthood. And it's basically a robot arm rocking a baby to sleep. It's fascinating, and obviously, like it's provocative, and it's on one level funny, but it's also on one level absolutely terrifying. There's so much that a competent and thoughtful use of digital technologies in art can do for us. And one last reference is Julian Oliver and his work, The Transparency Grenade, which I always cite as kind of one of the works that made me fall in love with digital art. It's essentially shaped as a grenade. It's almost as interesting, the narrative around that work and how it's traveled the world and how it's toured, because it's essentially a glass grenade that going through customs in various places. That's quite complicated. But it takes a screen grab of when it's set off, for want of a better term, it takes a screen grab of the things on it, any technological device on the same Wi-Fi network as it within remit. So the idea is take it to a town hall or to a government building, set it off, and then publish the the transparent kind of workings of that place or that city. So I think there's but real social change. It's not essential that works have kind of social weight to them, but there's real power in engaging in digital technology that we're only just scratching the surface with, really. So yeah.
Can I just add 1 second? I think that's so important, both those examples you gave. So one of the things that there's a lot of concern about, back to mobile phones, is how many parents are staring at their mobile phone while they're holding their baby at the moment. And questions like that make us really, it's not just, oh, can digital art have enough emotional content, but can digital life, have enough emotional content if we don't interrogate it and if we don't investigate it as artists?
That is a great point, Hannah, actually, and thank you all so much for sharing these brilliant thoughts. And Khaldoon, thank you again for chairing the conversation. As I said before, I think we could have stayed here for so long, because you've brought together like so much rich content that I'm sure gave everyone a lot of so many things to think about in the next few days, and also hopefully the British Council in Jordan. I'm looking forward to what happens next, and just wanted to say a big thank you to them as well for making this happen, and also for giving us the opportunity to curate this program. And we've got one more day, which is really exciting as well. But I'm looking forward to what happens tomorrow as well. But hopefully this is not a one-off. Hopefully we will continue these conversations in a different format and in a different time as well. So Hannah, Tom, Khaldoon, and also Matthew and Julie, thank you so much for your brilliant and insightful presentations. I hope everybody has a great evening. Thank you also to our amazing audience for being here, also for your great comments and questions as well. And as I said, we're coming back tomorrow and talking about engaging with audiences, and also talking about collaborations and also artists working online, and how what happened to art during the pandemic. So I hope to see you there. And in the meantime, just have a great evening, and thank you again for coming. And my colleague Hayley has shared in the chat a link for a feedback form. So we would be grateful if you could check that and let us know your comments and how we can make these events different. Thank you again, everyone. And have a great day. Bye from me.
Bye.